We're gonna start off with the sponsor of the event, is Casey Camarilla. He's the CEO and co-founder of Sprocket. Casey, it's great to have you with us. Give us a little bit about your background and your current role.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Dan. Case Camilleri here, CEO and co-founder of Sprocket Security. A little bit about my background. I spent the past about 16 years, maybe 17 years now, on the offensive side of cybersecurity. So, security consultant, penetration tester, breaking into companies, let them know how I did it, so the bad guys can, or we can fix it before the bad guys take advantage of it. So, started Sprocket Security because really I wanted to improve the way that we proactively identify vulnerabilities through the penetration testing and offensive security measures. And attack surface management is a big topic and big importance with that direction. So happy to be here, Dan.
Casey, it's great to have you. We're just talking about pronouncing mouse names. So Camilleri, I got that, get that right. So that's great to have you. Thanks for all you do. We're gonna also introduce Al. I'm Imran Hussein, who's Miller Knoll CISO. Imran, great to have you with us. Tell us about your company, your background, and your role at Miller Knoll.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Miller Knoll, which is actually located also in Michigan. So, Dan, I don't know how far you are from Holland, Michigan, but hopefully not too far. And oversee all of our global security as it pertains to security operations, governance, risk, and compliance, and of course, our attack surface management as well. I've been in the field for about 22 years now. Worked at other Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, very much as it pertains to cybersecurity. And I'm based out of Chicago.
Fantastic. Great to have you. Thanks for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Joe Marcical from he's from Ryerson. He's Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance. Joe, welcome to the panel. And please tell us about your background and your role at Ryerson.
Sure. So thank you. I've been doing this for about 24 years. So anything from on the defense side, InfoSec security, before it was really called cybersecurity, and really focused on it the last 15 years or so. I head up the cybersecurity group at Ryerson. We are about a $5 billion metals distribution and processing company. We have about 115 locations around North America, a couple in China, and about 4,000 employees.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for that. And before we really dive into some Q&A and group discussion, and we're going to talk about the landscape overall, probably should have introduced myself a little bit more formally. I'm Dan Lorman. I'm with Presidio, field CISO, more than 30 years in the security industry. Started my career at NSA, was in England with Lockheed and Mantech, and then 17 years in Michigan government as CISO, CTO, a lot of different roles in government. So it's great to be with this outstanding panel today on this important topic. And this landscape slide, I think, really is important. I'm not going to read through each of these, but some numbers that are really daunting that jump out at us. So I really want to just go down through the panel and start with Casey and just say, Casey, as we look at today's landscape as a whole, and these scary numbers, really, quite frankly, what are some thoughts you have on the current situation we find ourselves in the U.S. and around the world today?
Oh yeah, we have infrastructure and applications just growing at a phenomenal pace, right? The organizations are putting this in place to get ahead and use technology in every aspect that they have. But pair that with the DevOps world that we live in, where anyone with a credit card can actually just put something out there on the internet, right, related with you to your company with your company's data in it. And so, since that is so easy to do, we see infrastructure just growing and growing and growing, and companies are having a hard time, figuring out where's all the assets I have. And the larger the company, the harder it is, and the faster it moves.
Yeah, so Casey, just going back to you on some of these statistics, 84% of attacks paths originate from internet exposure. 94% of organizations lack full visibility in the service accounts. Are these numbers ringing true with what you're seeing at Sprocket?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely, definitely. The lack of visibility into a lot of accounts and infrastructure is probably the number one thing that we see that leads to discovery of vulnerabilities. A lot of times organizations are blind or they're busy building their organization, so they're not looking for the same thing that attackers are looking for day in, day out. So when you gain that visibility from the hacker's perspective, you really start to uncover different attack paths that could evolve. But it takes pairing that with the vulnerability data. Can that attack path actually happen? But you need to first start with the visibility of where the assets are, so you can start at the beginning of that.
Fantastic. So, Imran, when you look at this slide, what are your thoughts? I mean, what jumps out at you around the landscape we face in 2025?
Yeah, a handful of things, which is very important. So we know as we're looking at how we encompass our respective areas, specifically with operational technology, and then of course with information technology, and we are a manufacturing and retail company. You start to understand the different types of attack surfaces out there, and there are plenty. And I think what's very important to recognize out here is that when we talk about attack surface, right, we're talking about those potential entry points and attack vectors that can really have those significant attacks. And that's only ever increasing because of the fact that these entry points continue to increase. Part of what we deal with manufacturing is that now you're seeing a lot of manufacturing assets turning into IoT, right? So they're becoming Internet of Things, which means they have access to the internet. That's how people, whether it's a vendor, consultant, or internal employees, are managing those respective assets. That attack surface starts to grow. And as you can see, with the increase of other such type of exposures, common vulnerabilities are also going to play a deep part into that respective landscape as well. So this is constantly evolving. There isn't much visibility as we are seeing it right now. But that's also because of the fact that I think this is a new chapter to cybersecurity, how to approach it, what can you do to really reduce that attack surface area, and then how do you go ahead and, more importantly, mitigate that continuously as a part of your cycle.
Great. So, Joe, when you think about this list, I mean, maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts in general too. What when we see this shrinking response window. I mean, is that something you're seeing in your role? And then, what other things jump out at you around the landscape?
Yeah, certainly. I definitely feel for Imran's statements around the manufacturing space because we're in that space as well. So we deal with that. But I mean, the prevalence of the exposure of attack paths. I mean, yesterday's feature was tomorrow's attack path. Especially things like and then you take that into with shrinking response windows. I look at Hafnium and Log4j, which we're a little bit older by now, but are good examples that you have these things hanging off your network. The vulnerability gets announced, and within hours, the threat actors are already hitting the servers, and so then you have to start being reactive. So again, that fast exposure or a constantly changing um, uh, external exposure to in response to the reduced response windows really can make for a stressful response, especially if you don't know exactly how you're presenting to the internet or what's hanging off your network.
Great points. Thank you. So we're going to bring down this slide and just have a panel.
Dan,
Oh,
there's
yeah,
one more thing I want to comment on this is for our listeners in today's landscape, probably the importance of the shrinking response window. As an attacker and kind of mimicking the same thing that attackers are doing, the exploits are just coming out extremely fast, and sometimes before CVEs are even actually acknowledged and known, right? And so we see that happening quite a bit. And the Move It one, there's a great example, but it's also happening with techniques too. Techniques don't necessarily always have CVEs, and so being able to look in your environment and say, okay, where's all the Move It assets that I have? Where is that software in my attack surface? You should be able to answer that question within seconds. And if you can't, then that's probably the first place to kind of focus on improving your organization is how can you answer questions like that extremely fast.
great points there. And I want to bring this window down and continue that conversation with you, Casey, because we start thinking about the whole wider issue of attack surface visibility. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what does attack surface visibility really mean to you in the context of what Sprocket Security does in your organization?
Yeah. So we wanted to mimic, the attackers, right? And find all the attack surface and be comprehensive about it. So attack surface management is a data feed to us. similar to how threat intel is a data feed. It's just data that does need to be paired with something else to help you answer the questions. It's a data feed that you can look through to identify different things about your organization. I just gave the Move It example, but I do primarily think of it as a data feed. Now, attack surface management and visibility means different things to different people, even different vendors as well, right? So I think the thing that's clouded the understanding of what ASM is attack surface management started as a data feed. And then I think there are some vendors out there that says, well, that data maybe is just not that valuable or, the data itself. So let's give some more information, some more vulnerabilities, and they pair it with CVEs and technologies and other things like that. And so you start to get some simple vulnerability information in management around the ASM. And so you kind of have a ASM plus vulnerability information. Now, the thing I would caution to most people is that, that vulnerability information may not be validated, right? Just because you have a WordPress version X doesn't mean it is actually vulnerable to those 150 different vulnerabilities, right? So if you pull back what is at the heart of attack surface management, you want to first answer the question of like, where are all my assets and what metadata is around that. And assets can be more than just domains, DNS records, IP addresses, ports, websites. It can also be the technologies and the metadata about those. Where is that IP located geographically? What technologies are being used on that web application, and even user accounts in your organization, right? A simple username can actually be used in many different aspects. So from the beginning, attack surface visibility needs to also uncover and discover all those assets, but then it also needs to identify when those assets change, when they come and go. Did someone accidentally open up the Elasticsearch or the database port to the internet? Is this device new? How new was it? Was it here yesterday? Has it been here for 4 years? Like, those are all the questions that you need to answer. So it first starts with the data, and then you can add parity with the vulnerability information and enrich that data, and then even the penetration testing. Does this asset have a vulnerability? Does it impact my business? So that is what ASM means to Sprocket and myself.
That's great. Good stuff. I mean, Joe, Imran, any thoughts about attack surface visibility overall? Anything that Casey just said?
Well, you brought up a good point about knowing how long it's been there, right? Because you need to know how long you need to, having that historical data is actually more key than a lot of people realize. So that's what I caught on to. But I definitely agree with Casey's overall aspects.
Yeah, just to piggyback off what Joe said, I think really trying to unravel those assets, understanding what those are, and recognizing the fact that these things are starting to permeate and they come in such unusual forms that you've got to understand exactly how your assets are and how that certainly lays out the land for attack surfaces and how they're going to be approached from the fact that you need to start recognizing what these potential threats can actually do.
Very cool. So, Joe, just taking this a little bit further, thinking about the role of automation in all of this, what role do automated tools play in providing attack surface visibility? And, how do you ensure they're effective? How do you think about tools?
You know, so it's been my experience that it's been extremely difficult to understand your attack surface unless you're automating it, right? The attack surface management tools can range from anything from external exposure to the company, to vulnerability, to automated pen testing. Really, the automated, attack surface management area is crucial to understand areas that you didn't even know existed. Things like shadow IT, rogue devices, misunderstood deployments. That's occurred as well as, there you could follow all the processes within a company to deploy something, and somebody misunderstood either what was being deployed or how to deploy it. Misconfigured deployment, I think that's kind of a line, but it can happen as well. And then, of course, changes in features. Companies are constantly, again, I mentioned this before, yesterday's features, tomorrow's vulnerability, or they take something away and it changes your attack surface. So, in general, you have this automated system. You want to set it up once you have a baseline and you understand what's occurring. You have something that is alerting you on changes in that baseline or changes from the norm. Also, it can be critical, absolutely critical when a new vulnerability comes up because A, you should know right away as part of your asset management, do you have that problem? And B, how it's exposed to the internet, because if it's exposed to the internet, you have a whole new priority. If it's not, then you can probably slot that in appropriately into your remediation. Now, I say all that, but attack surface management, or at least automation around that, can also be a nightmare from my experience. Just giving a tool, a domain, or a couple of IPs and say, "Hey, go wild, tell me what you find." You're going to get an interesting set of reports back. So the burden of proof is going to be on your team to validate whether or not you actually own those. For the items that you find valid, right? You should understand the what, the why, the how. You should have that inventory. And it should be documented and tracked. And then, human judgment is always going to be required in attack surface management to both help you deal with those false positives, but also the items that are legitimate, but you simply didn't know about. Once you've established that baseline, you have a responsive playbook on things that have changed, and then you align that with the risk tolerance of the company.
Great response there. I mean, Casey, when you think about this, to follow up with that same question, what are the different types of tools that you come across when you think about this from Rocket Security's perspective? Whether that be vulnerability scanners, other types of things. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Uh, I actually think about it just like the attackers do, right? What are the tools that I do to do reconnaissance on an organization? And so when I break that down into specific tools underneath the hood, there's a ton of different port scanners that you can use. Mmap being the most famous one, but there's Mass Scan, Naboo. There's all these new ones that you can use. So the tooling of what actually gets the job done honestly just needs to be reliable. So if you're looking to say what's the metadata around this website? What are the headers? You can use a variety of tools. HTTPX will do it for you now, but what web used to do it way back in the day. There's other things like Wapalizer. So you can go on and on and on, and almost the specific tool doesn't matter. Is it comprehensive and accurate is the thing that we want, right?
Yeah.
And then also can you scale it out? Because if you're a large organization, you have many assets, you got to run this thing at scale.
Awesome. Imran, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I want to go back to a key word that Joe mentioned, which was automation. And so for us, in terms of what we're using as it pertains to that is SOAR, right? So
Yeah.
security orchestration automation response. And why I find that to be beneficial is because it is almost a platform of a variety of different tools that most companies are already using, right? They're going to be using endpoint detection, EDR, SIM, firewall. It's actually bringing all that intelligence together, and then what you're doing is you're going to automate that workflow. And that's going to be very important. So when we talk about automation, we talk about the part of playbooks that are really helping to go ahead and respond against certain types of threats. The challenge, of course, is how up to date are your playbooks? Because threats are constantly evolving. How do you go ahead and make that automation repetitive within your security tasks so you've got something which is predefined and that you can roll it out? So I think that's very good to apply in terms of that SOAR method, and then also understanding exactly the key to it, which is responding to those incidents that can really get out of hand. That's the way that I would really go ahead and approach some form of automation that incorporates a lot of different security tools to really provide you with that key type of solution to go ahead and utilize.
So Imran, when you think about that, that's very helpful. How do you view the role of threat intelligence in this, and how does that, obviously attack surface management's got lots of different threats. How can threat intelligence help an organization gain a clearer view of the attacks that are happening?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and I think this is going to be important for everybody to recognize. And I know Casey had talked about it because the interpretation of attack surface tends to waver a little bit here and there, maybe by industry, maybe by organization. The way that you want to really kind of understand threat intelligence against attack surface and its visibility is to really understand where your unknown assets are. Take the assumption that they are out there. Take the assumption that shadow IT does exist, or that there are going to be third-party risks from suppliers or vendors, or that basically you've got assets which are exposed to other organizations that you may be doing business with, such as partners, right? So understanding those unknown assets is key. And then also recognizing the fact and respecting that emerging threats happen all the time, right? So a couple of things from there, which are very key to all this, right? You have to understand what those variables of compromises are going to be, right? So you have to understand the tactics and the techniques as it pertains to your industry, right? I'm in manufacturing and retail. Understand what those emerging threats could be within that respective landscape. And then understand exactly what type of threats or actor behavior can really go ahead and expose that attack surface. And then, of course, assessing any type of vulnerability exposure as well. So we tend to forget about that vulnerability remediation, and that awareness is somehow tabled to the side. It's really not. It's actually really a part of what you want to do when you're measuring your attack surface. And then I would also say monitoring other areas that you just simply are not necessarily exposed to all the time. The dark web is something which is very important to understand, and how that plays a role in your attack surface, because there's various different types of information, different types of data that can help consolidate, and then leverage by threat actors to go ahead and target your specific critical assets. And then I would also say how threat intelligence really helps your attack service is that it improves your incident response. Going back to my store example, the more you can go ahead and feed your playbooks, the more you can automate your workflows with those emerging threats, trying to reduce those false positives, the better you're going to be in terms of improving your threat detection. So all of that really plays a key in terms of why threat intelligence has a massive, massive incentive to your attack surface.
So on that same point then, do you see that as like real-time decision making? Okay, now you have some indication, you've got additional data. Does that modify how you respond in a given incident?
I would say so. I think by gathering that type of information, by validating it, which I think is important, that's the type of intelligence you're going to want to use in order to inject that into your solutions that you're using. And that's really going to help you build out your playbook, your risk management, how you go ahead and respond to security incident. If you're working with a SOC, if you're working with a managed MDR, all of them are going to benefit from that. So the more information, the better awareness from that real-time activity, the more it's going to really incentivize your protection in terms of what you need to do in order to feel confident with the type of protection you're laying out there.
Excellent. Casey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. That's great comments, Imran.
Yeah. We provide threat intelligence in the form of mimicking the hackers and mimicking what they're actually doing and showing the actual impact. So even as a penetration testing company, we're actually providing a form, just one aspect of threat intelligence. And I think the only thing I'll add to that, because I agree with everything that Imran said, is that if you don't do anything with the data, or if you haven't set up systems and processes to do something with the data coming in, then it's not you're not setting yourself up for success. So you do have to implement something like SOAR or some sort of operations to act upon this data and the information that you have.
Yeah, and no, we're gonna jump to questions at the end, but since you just said that, I'm gonna jump to one. We're getting some great questions, by the way, coming from the audience. So thank you. Keep them coming in. We're gonna get to your questions. But one on that very point you just brought up, Casey, just came in. Back to Imran, then we'll jump back to Casey again here. But how would you automate SOAR, and integrate both with AI and UEBA?
So
Back to Imran. I did that. That was
I was gonna say maybe Imran or Joe can start this off since they're implementing that on their end.
Joe, you want to go?
No, I'll let you go. It sounds like
Okay.
a good program going on there. Spoke well.
All right. Sure. So, what's important for SOAR, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit because I've got a little bit experience with it, is really how to go ahead and make sure, number one, your security alerts are being ingested into your SOAR tool, right? So those security alerts, as I stated before, coming from your intrusion detection systems, whether it's IDS or IPS, from your firewalls, from your SIM, from your WAF, those types of alerts are going to be very important. The one thing I will say is the partnership between SOAR and SIM. I think that can't be underestimated because SIM has a huge play when it comes to security alerting. And a lot of times, I'll talk from previous experience, MDR sometimes overlook some of those security alerts or even threats that are happening that a SIM can pick up. So SOAR and SIM specifically, those security alerts need to be ingested into a data lake, which can really kind of create this opportunity to understand better your forensics when it comes to how your store is going to work. The second part to it is your alert, right? How are you triaging? So when you actually get this type of information and you're getting different types of intelligence data that can be cross-pollinated, right? Now you're kind of creating this enriched type of data set that can really not only go ahead and prepare you for future incidents, but it's also taking the historical context of what you've already gone through and bringing that up to the front as well. So I think that's very important when it comes to building out an appropriate SOAR. The the second part to that also is like I mentioned before, your playbooks. How are those things working? So a playbook is really what you set up within a context in terms of saying, hey, here's an emerging threat that's coming through. Let's just say it's a more sophisticated, complicated denial of service attack. Very generic, but certainly with a lot more amped up in terms of the different types of complexity it can apply against your attack surfaces. You need to go ahead and make sure that your playbooks are being predefined by understanding specifically where it can actually attack you, right? So that might be on IPs, domains, your confederated states, your files, whatever that might be. And then understanding exactly how those playbooks can certainly isolate those type of endpoints, which can be that can be attacked, that can be compromised. So there are several things that you can certainly do right out the gate that can build up and beef up your SOAR program, and you can do it with certainly the existing tools already out there. You don't have to buy multiple different types of packages and programs. Play with what you have, build against it, use that data, build it within the lake, and then inject that into your SOAR, creating those playbooks. And you've got something going now in terms of how to respond against those emerging threats.
Very, very well said. That's fantastic. Joe, you want to add anything to that, or?
Well, clearly playbooks are going to be your force multiplier. I mean, SOAR is definitely a key service, although a lot of companies right now either are in their infancy or, it's cost prohibitive. So I would speak to the other side of that is how do you do that without SOAR? And so a lot of that would be alignment with your MSP or the other escalation and processes there. But your playbooks and well done playbooks are going to be the basis for where you're working. And then you need to shift left, right, up, down, depending on what the actual attack comes in. But if you are not, if you don't have incident response plans, if you don't have those playbooks, you're going to be starting from zero when something happens. So those are all key aspects.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Abdullah, thank you for the breaking out UEBA, user entity and behavior analytics. I think I knew that, but that was well said there. Thank you. So I want to jump back over to Casey, keep the conversation going. We are going to get to some more of these questions that are coming in at the end, but shift a little bit over on this, Casey, and we think about challenges in achieving full attack surface visibility. What do you see as the biggest challenges organizations face when trying to gain full visibility in their attack surface?
Well, the very first challenge is some aren't even looking just yet, right? Some have not made it a priority to say, I need to understand what my attack surface is. And even if you're a smaller organization, we work with some smaller software companies that, are deploying 50 times a day. So they're changing, their applications tremendously and infrastructure, right? So they realize that, hey, we need to actually start looking at this stuff, even though we're not a giant company. And if you are a giant company, right, you have a lot to identify. And so when you do implement attack surface management, the challenge that you'll have is it comprehensive? And you may even go down the build versus buy. The build road is extremely difficult because it costs a lot of money. There's a lot of care and feeding. So I would probably say work on your business in other areas, and maybe buy to just get that quick injection of the data. And then you can start to say, how can the business work with the data? Because those that build never really get to a state where it's comprehensive enough. And that's the number one fear with attack surface, right? Is that the unknowns that we're talking about, what you don't know that you have. Um, and then I'd say another one is not knowing what to look for, right? The hacker's perspective is the huge challenge. Not everyone is playing the offensive security role day in, day out to say where the hacker's looking, what type of technologies are they looking for, what data attributes or enrichments about these assets do we need to know about, right? And so if you put the hacker's perspective into it, then you kind of start to get an understanding of where to look. Another challenge that is still to this day really hard is the dynamic infrastructure and applications. So you could host your website on Amazon S3, and every single time you call out to Amazon S3, it's changing an IP address and it's reallocating that, right? So you got to know when something is dynamic, when it's not dynamic, and how to follow through and recursively look at that information. That business logic can be complex. And when you do that at volume and scale, you need to make sure that your data remains accurate and consistent, which is extremely hard to do. So, those are kind of some of the challenges. I'd say, okay, once you have a solution implemented, I'd say another challenge that we see is not working with the data, and even some companies forgetting that they have the data once they do implement it, right? So, example, we had a vulnerability that came out just the other day, and we had some customers forget that heck, Sprocket provides an ASM. You could just go in there, look, and get your answer in 20 seconds. So it's a mindset that needs to adapt or change just a little bit. That you don't need to spend time hunting once you've actually built this. In fact, that's, I'd say, an indicator that you've succeeded is when you can turn to your teams and say, hey, fire drill, where do we have X technology? Or where do we have, is there any port 8080s open across our public infrastructure? And if they can come back with that answer within seconds, then you know that you have a good amount of data. And then is that comprehensive? Are you looking at all the right places would be the next question to challenge that. But those are some of the most common challenges that we see. And then even when you are working with the data, to just understand how to prioritize different data. Is this change more important than that change? And is this new discovery even important? Does it require security testing or any sort of analysis or deeper dive? Those are all the challenges that we commonly see.
Fantastic. Joe or Imran, either of you have a story you can share of whether the current employer or previous, or those in the industry. You can be anonymous if you'd like, of organizations that have faced those challenges and really achieving full attack surface visibility. Any thoughts there?
Remember?
Well, I will say this. I don't know if I have a particular story, but I can tell you, in many cases, most companies are simply they lack the visibility, right, for third parties. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone, right? Because your risks are being created, they're being expanded through SaaS applications, right? Supply chain, cloud. I mean, all of those respective areas are increasing your attack surface, and that visibility becomes less and less because, again, it's a third party. So they're increasing your exposure points. You have limited visibility in terms of what your organization can do in terms of accounting for the oversight against those vendors and what security practices they may have. So I think there's a variety of things that you have to look at. The other part to it is really compliance risks, right? Because there's also going to be that avenue to go ahead and look at not only just your attack surfaces, but what is your attack surfaces and how it's being somewhat compromised against possible compliance controls that you have in place. So I think it's important to recognize that while there are issues, there are certain things that can be done. Um, Implementing zero trust, I think that's something that many companies want to at least accept and adhere to. Don't know necessarily if it's the easiest thing to do, but MFA, network segmentation against vendors, especially that are using SaaS, I think those are good solutions to go ahead and apply, or good controls to apply. And then, of course, making sure that you've got continuous monitoring. I mentioned SIM before. I think that's an excellent way to go ahead and reduce that surface attack area when it comes to dealing with vendors in your space.
Fantastic. Hey, Joe, on that same point, Imran brought up third party vendors, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, kind of go a little deeper into that. How do third party vendors impact your attack surface visibility? And maybe you can share what steps that you're taking to mitigate those risks.
Yeah. So I saw a question flash up is what is some of the underrated risks that companies are not understanding that they have? Clearly, if you don't know what's out there or it's attached to your network, that's going to be probably your biggest one, right? Your second biggest one, as far as I'm concerned, is going to be third party vendors. So you're not going to make it very far, especially in the current internet, if you don't have third party vendors. So you need to have that mature third party vendor management program to understand your security exposure. Need to do, a thorough job. And that's not just, okay, we collected a couple SOC 2 reports or an ISO report and we asked them some questions. In our experience, we've had vendors that have submitted false SOC 2 reports and ISO reports. We've had them submit reports for, their cloud providers, so AWS, Azure, something like that. And if you hadn't, given that another look or really dove into that, you could just say, well, we got the SOC 2. We've even had third parties that have literally been they've been compromised and have been announcing it in the news while we're doing a review. And the people that we have been in contact with at the vendor have just been all shoulders, right? They don't say anything. And then when we even ask them about that, they basically gaslight us. So you have to really understand and have a mature program. So you want to make sure that you have that third party risk management program that is watching your vendors, alerting you to changes, breaches, security stance, even vulnerabilities. You should have plans to shut that software down. Nobody wants to shut down software or disable software, but that's part of cyber resiliency is how to shut down a dysfunctioning part of the software or vulnerable part of the software or of the company and allow the rest of the company to work around that. If you don't have that third party risk management program, you're basically asking to be compromised. Somewhere somebody's going to hit them, they're going to hit you. And that doesn't even mean something like a Target or a Home Depot attack where, there's a pipeline. It could be they compromise them, and the data that they've gleaned can make for a very convincing and targeted social engineering or business email compromise against you or the company. So you need to have that third party inventory. You need to rate them by risks, especially in how their proximity is to your company and to your crown jewels, and then be reactive and have that plan to mitigate around them for the company's greater good.
Interesting you mentioned I'd never heard somebody say they've actually received a fake, SOC 2. I mean, what did you guys do in that situation? I hope you fired the company. I mean, that's like, man,
Yeah.
that's pretty, I mean, if somebody's submitting a fake SOC 2 to you, that's like fraud, isn't it?
Effectively, I mean, they would have a different response that there was, is so granted, we didn't have the smoking gun of the fakeness of it, but all the evidence was there. Again, they would have, some of these can spin some pretty convincing stories on why that particular SOC 2 report is valid. Although, again, you can't find the background information of it. Ultimately, for us, I mean, we have a really good third party risk management person, and she accumulates all this data into, 35, 40-page risk report. Cybersecurity is not the department of no. I mean, occasionally you can say, no, do not do this. But for the most part, it's to, give a risk rating and risk recommendation to executive management. Ultimately, in these cases, or in the multiple cases it's occurred, the company did not go forward based on recommendations. But really, that's what it comes down to is just part of the report.
Yeah, great point on cybersecurity can't be the organization of no. For those who want to go out to learn on cybersecurity, I've got a lot of blogs on that and how I almost got fired by saying no to Wi-Fi 20 years ago. So I totally agree with you on that. You got to get to yes. You got to have solutions. You can't just say no. You got to look at peers. You got to see what those answers are and get to yes with workable solutions, right? On time, on budget, with the right level of security. So I love that. We're gonna jump to audience questions here in a moment. We got maybe one more big one. I want to jump to Imran. One more question for you, and offer up and as a panel. Then we're going to jump to some of these questions. But what would you say your tips or recommendations would be for visibility and prioritization? So when you start thinking about how to best measure and prioritize all the different things we have on our plate, the different components of attack surface and management, what to avoid. What are some best practices that you can offer to the audience today?
Yeah, that number one, a great question. I think there's a couple things you need to do. Number one, read the data because I think that's very important for visibility, right? And we talked about this earlier. streamlining that type of data from your various security tools, kind of consolidating it. If you've got AI you're using, maybe you can crunch out that data and create some cool metrics about it. But recognizing that type of information will help you with your visibility. Second part I would say is risk assessment, right? You need to really risk assess that type of respective vulnerabilities and exposure within your attack surface. And then finally, understanding what you can do in terms of mitigation, right? When it's necessary, where it's necessary. So that I would say I'd start off with that. But then when we break it down some more, you're looking at a couple of areas that any attack surface would fall into, which is two areas, which is external attack surface and you got your internal attack surface. The variables that you're going to look at with both of them may slightly different. And I think it's also subjective. There's no template to it. So I don't necessarily want to say this is the way it is. But if I had to advocate, I'd be looking at certain variables such as domains and subdomains, right? Understanding exactly where your APIs are. If you're working with third-party vendors, APIs is a big thing. They have a lot of exposures that can happen, and threat actors can certainly go ahead and take advantage of that. I would say open ports. That's very important. I would say also your cloud infrastructure. If that's something you're using, if you're using AWS and you're using S3 buckets, how could your cloud storage be misconfigured where exposures could surface, right? And then, of course, third-party dependencies. We've talked about that. I also say for internal attack surfaces, you've got endpoints and devices, which are going to be very important. Make sure you're looking at that, understanding your asset inventory, whether it's workstations, IoT, as I mentioned before, servers. Those need to really be accounted for. I would also say your user privilege and access. I can't underestimate that, how important the privileged accounts are and auditing against it to make sure that you've got a good handle in terms of how your attack surface is laid out. But more importantly, within that attack surface, who actually has privileges to respective areas within the network. And then I would also probably look at configuration weaknesses within your servers, any type of issues with outdated software. Legacy systems are obviously a very big key to that in terms of what you're going to do. I would say, and this is probably the biggest advice I could give, you need to prioritize. Prioritize the prioritize, right? Which means dig deeper. To me, the most important thing are your critical assets. Are your ERP systems protected? Can you mitigate and reduce that attack surface to a point where you feel very confident and comfortable in terms of how you are handling what that exposure is to your ERP systems or your critical assets? Because that's going to be the most important part for your respective organization. That's where threat attackers really want to hurt you. They really want to kill you there. So looking at it from that holistic perspective, understand your internal attack surface, understand your external attack surface, look at those variables, digest that information, and make the appropriate decisions based off of that.
Great advice. So thank you for that. We're going to jump to some audience questions now. We got maybe 10 minutes left. We're going to have some final thoughts by our panel, but I'm going to do back kind of rapid fire on this. Casey, maybe just throw the first one at this, but other guys, if you want to jump in, how important is having an accurate software bill of materials, an SBOM, in the process? Casey, thoughts on that?
Yeah. I view that as data enrichment, right? You have an application and you want to know what are all the different libraries and different technologies that are used that make up with that. Why? Because it's a data feed that you're going to use to cross-reference to say, okay, is there any vulnerabilities associated with these versions of the libraries that I use? So jQuery version X, right? What vulnerabilities do I have? So if you, again, SBOM, it kind of goes back to, do you know what you have? And it's answering that question. But again, the importance of, okay, what do you do with that data then, right? If you're just doing it to supply an audit, then you're going to get a lot of data that comes back of like, hey, you have 5,000 vulnerabilities. And it's like, but do you really? Like, do you even use that function in the library? So understanding the question at hand, what problem you're solving with the SBOM is actually the first step, right? Because if you have the data and it's not helping you in the organization answer a question accurately, then why are you gathering that information? But I'm a firm believer that SBOM is a great start to figure out, okay, what do I have? in my attack surface? What am I using in my application? So that way you can cross-reference that data to say, all right, where could there be vulnerabilities? And then you can validate and prioritize those vulnerabilities to see if they actually have impact on your business.
Fantastic. Great answer. Yeah. Guys, anybody jump in on this one? I know Joe or Imran or Casey, any of you, where do most organizations underestimate their exposure and why?
Well, I mentioned this earlier, clearly not knowing that they have something on their network that is externally or even internally exposed, as Imran brought up, the internal attack surface management is just as important in knowing, where the company's, soft GUI insides can be exposed or compromised. So I would say that clearly third party risk management, as I noted before, and of course vulnerability management are probably the top three that are kind of hanging off or around the network that threat actors are going to try to compromise.
Fantastic. And then we answered some of these other questions. You answered the question about zero trust and SASE. We kind of hit on that. I would have jumped. Maybe Imran, you want to take a stab at this one, or want somebody else jump in? With some great leaders on the call, how have you gotten engagement from your end users to make security priority one? As we train and explain, a lot of users don't understand the importance of security still. Imran, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a challenge anywhere, and especially, I actually had a conversation this morning with an area of end users who still kind of get paranoid anytime we decide to go ahead and run some type of audit checks, especially against identity access, as an example, right? I think it's more about a campaign and the strategy to go ahead and really kind of promote the values that you're trying to do. So whether it's the fact that you're trying to go ahead and increase your security awareness training by bringing in this type of new ideas and understanding about AI threats that are certainly out there, or it could be such things as providing better identity controls. There has to be that buy-in that you have to get. Easier said than done, but it's more about, again, that slow roll of a campaign that you can really get out there and talk to them about these type of tools that you're using, why it's going to be beneficial to the organization, and how does a user benefit from it, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, all your users are also a part of that attack surface. They all have some type of hand to play within it, and their footprints are all over there. So to discuss that in a way which makes sense, to make it more effective by saying this is more of a holistic approach. This is not just cybersecurity. It works better from the perspective of communicating that in a degree that everyone will buy into what you're trying to do with the tools that you're trying to implement and use.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would just add, somebody said top-down approach in corporate culture. I worked for a security awareness training company for years. I won't go into that, but just make it brief, frequent, focus, make it engaging training. Don't keep teaching people the things teach them things they don't already know. And people always hunger for learning new things. They always want a new iPhone, right? They always want the latest iPhone, or maybe they can wait a year or two or three. But then nobody's still using an iPhone 1. They always want to upgrade to the latest thing. So, keep it relevant, keep it focused on how this affects their family at home, at work. A lot of people working from home. If you do those things, we used to use gamified training as well, but keeping it interesting and engaging and teaching them things they don't know, that'll get them engaged, and it can be very effective. Imran, you want to jump?
Yeah, Dan, I just wanted to add one last thing. So we've been talking about internal attack surface, external attack surface. Joe mentioned a handful of things as well on there, all good stuff. One attack surface that we don't really talk about is that human attack
Yeah,
surface,
exactly.
right? And that's starting to evolve more with phishing and social engineering risks, especially how it's being infused with AI. So now you've got that's a different game, and how that's starting to impact credentials when it comes to leaks, to insider threats. All of that is going to be very important. So I definitely want to emphasize human attack surface as being a part of that larger grand scheme of the attack surface as well.
Yeah, Aaron really hits the nail on the head, especially with the human attack surface. What we've done, and we've had fairly good success, is if you can tie all those things back down to, and I think Dan mentioned it too, is down to the human and why does this matter to you and your family, right? We definitely want to teach you how to protect the company and be the human firewall, extend that out, but really hits home when you say, yes, everything we're teaching you has a direct line to your personal life. And so you can bring all this. And one of the greatest compliments we can hear is, I told my mother, I told my sister, I told so and so the things I learned, and they did X, Y, Z. And it's like, wow, okay, they're listening. Right.
Fantastic. Hey guys, we're getting ready to wrap up here. Maybe I have one last question, then we'll do one final round, maybe each a minute to leave us with a gold nugget. But number of questions in here about AI and how does AI fit into this? Casey, maybe some thoughts overall on that, and we could talk about different AI agents and attack surface management. How's that going to play in predictive threat intelligence? I mean, any thoughts you can share on that, Casey?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because just the other day, I was using AI again on a different data set of vulnerabilities and classifications of those vulnerabilities. And uh, here's my takeaway with AI and a lot of my experiences. It blows my mind what it can do. Uh, but junk data in is junk data out. So in many times it does a bad job of parsing nice structured data to give you the great results, and it'll be so confident when it's wrong, right? And you just need to be careful that when you implement it, like, are you confident in its accuracy of what it's telling you to do? So here's areas that I've seen AI working really great is when I give it a smaller, more focused problem versus saying go do all these things, right? And a really great aspect of that is here is a vulnerability and say it's cross-site scripting, and it's I use frameworks X, Y, and Z. So you feed it with some data to say these are the frameworks that I use in my web application. How would I go about fixing a cross-site scripting? And then just provide it as much data as you can, and give it a narrow focus and say how would you actually fix this problem or assist me with this. So just I'd say just kind of close those gaps. Don't let it go everywhere because then it will just kind of give you who knows what. So if you focus it, then you're going to have great results. And the heuristic side of things, saying take a look at this data, what trends do you see? Those are helpful in spotting areas that you're not thinking about. Again, always questioning whether the data is accurate, but it helps you think of things that you didn't normally think about, and think about how you can use that in the operations and the people processes that you have when you need to actually go do something about alert that you got or data that you got. Because we've been talking a lot on this call with, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information that you can get your hands on, but then again, how do you validate and prioritize that information?
Fantastic. Guys, we're almost out of time. I want to just do one final 30-second. We'll go down and start with Imran, go to Joe, and then wrap up with Casey. Just one 30-second gold nugget you could leave our audience with. If there's one thing that they could do as a next step, what would that be? And I often tell people, Thanksgiving's not coming around the corner. I guess we have Easter in some areas, but families get together and say, one thing I remember about that webinar from a few weeks ago, what would that one thing be you'd want them to take away? We'll start with Imran, and we'll go down to Joe and then Casey. What would one gold nugget be, Imran?
Yeah, I don't think you should underestimate the data that you can get. And I think people don't necessarily value it. Get that data from your various security tools, see what you can do to consolidate it, and then create this type of information that can really help you with your risk assessment, which can help you with your threat detection, and that could eventually help you with some automation where you can use it and apply it.
Fantastic. Joe?
Yeah, Imran is really in on that, the data set, and I absolutely agree. I would bring back in what Casey's discussion on AI and making sure that you understand. He used a really cool, good word, which was assist, right? Another good word would be augment the human. So you have this great tool that can dig through the data and find the needles in the haystack that you may not know is there. Also, you have to validate that, right? And you have to make sure that you understand what the output is. And then, of course, not the kind of shiny tool syndrome with AI. You're so busy looking at the AI alerts and validating whether they exist or not. You may be missing, the elephant that just walked through or pounded through the wall. So make sure that you are still keeping your core processes in place, and the AI and the data should all be augmenting the threat analysts or the other tools.
Fantastic. Casey, final thought.
Final thought, I think the main takeaway would be like, what is seat time and how can I implement that process? And the reason for that is um, The CTEM covers almost all the stages that we've been talking about today: scoping, discovery, prioritization. ASM contributes to all of those. Validation of the data that you're getting, and then mobilization. How do we go about, giving power to users and processes to actually go ahead and fix the things that we're talking about? So, that would be my takeaway, is that, a lot of what we're talking about today, it starts with ASM, but then there's also some processes further downstream that we need to implement.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate the panel. Fantastic job. I want to thank the audience for joining us today, and certainly thank Sprocket Security for sponsoring this event. And so for today, we'll say so long, and hopefully you can join us for another webinar in the near future. But for now, thanks. Have a great day.